I'm going to say something up front here that might get a few responses. Wild Gunman is not a video game. I mean, there is a Wild Gunman video game, but I'm talking about the 1974 amusement machine that Nintendo made. And for that matter, neither was EVR Race, Nintendo's arcade machine from 1975 that's also lost media. Now this isn't because they're not games. They very clearly are. It's just the defining feature of video games is video. Wild Gunman used film projection, and while EVR Race actually had videotape and a television screen, all of the results were pre-recorded. There was no interactive element to the images. Now all of this might seem a bit pedantic, but it really does matter. Letting a player control the images that appear on a screen and using those to play a game was an absolutely radical concept, something that overturned everything. While Wild Gunman and EVR Race were just mild extensions of things that had existed for decades. That doesn't reflect on their quality, though I think EVR Race sounds kind of boring even by 1975 standards. It's just they weren't part of the revolution that had gotten kicked off by Atari. And it's why the subject of this video, the Nintendo Color TV game system, was Nintendo's very first video game. Well, let's make a small sideways hop here. Atari's Pong might not have been the first video game, but it was the first video game that mattered. In the early 70s, it was taking the US by storm. And there were plenty of imitators, except this isn't an imitator. This is the game on the Magnavox Odyssey that Pong might have been inspired by. Magnavox sued Atari over Pong, and that's going to feed back into our story pretty soon. Atari made a home version of Pong, a standalone unit that plugged into a television set and played just that game. And when that became a hit, everybody made their own version of it. Now the Pong craze was concentrated in the United States. And that doesn't mean that people in other countries weren't watching and seeing how successful it was. And so Japan got its very first video game console, the Epoch TV Tennis, or Electro Tennis like it says on the label. This bombed hard, but it didn't stop Epoch from trying again, and other manufacturers from getting in on it. And by 1977, consumers had a pretty big variety of Pong units to choose from in Japanese stores. And that's where Nintendo comes in. Still a toy company that had just dipped their toe into some amusement center concepts, Nintendo wanted their own Pong system. And they found one in development at Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi handled the technical side of development, while Nintendo handled the business and distribution end. That wound up being more important than it seemed at first glance. First, Nintendo licensed the concept of the table tennis game from Magnavox, and then in the mid-80s would sue Magnavox to break their patent on video games, and succeed by pointing out the existence of Tennis for Two. Nintendo also had the idea that they wouldn't sell a Pong system, they would sell two of them. The Color TV Game 6 came out first, and then it was followed a week later by the Color TV Game 15. And the clever thing, from a manufacturing perspective, is that the two systems were identical. At least internally. The Color TV System 6 was sold at a loss, while the higher price tag on the Color TV Game 15 let it make a profit, even with the small amount of additional hardware. The two-prong approach worked. The low-end system drove most other competitors away, while the high-end system's advantages were so obvious that many people gravitated to that. The result was that the Color TV Game 15 sold almost 1 million units, and the TV Game 6 sold about 100,000. Which is pretty respectable for a console in 1977, where you couldn't even add games to it. So what exactly did you get for your extra 5,000 yen with the Color TV Game 15? First, detachable controllers. On the 6 model, the controllers are built right into the unit, which was fairly common at the time. But with the 15, players weren't huddled in next to each other. Second, and more importantly, the 6 model came with 3 games built in, while the 15 came with 8. Of course, the 6 actually had all 8 built in, but the Switch was restricted so that it would only show 3. Now, getting 5 extra games might sound like a real deal, but really, 7 of the games were exactly the same, just slightly different playfields. Now, you might be saying to yourself, why don't these systems have 6 games and 15 games? And, well, according to Nintendo, they do. Nintendo considered one of the option switches to be a whole new game when you used it. Yeah, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Because of this, all the footage I'm capturing is from the TV game 15. The platforms are effectively identical, except for one detail on my units, so why not use the better one? The systems are powered by 6 C-cell batteries, which means you'll find a lot of junky ones that have had batteries leak in them. They're not wildly expensive systems, though. I spent about 4,000 yen each on these, and they came with boxes and power supplies, which were an optional add-on for people. As you might expect for video game hardware from 1977, the only output to a television is RF, radio frequency. Effectively, the consoles act as television stations, creating a broadcast signal, but one so weak that it can only be carried over a wire. And as 1977 technology, shielding is almost non-existent here. My signal is absolutely terrible, and you'll note that the picture actually gets worse when I'm moving paddles, probably due to a voltage drop occurring when I turn the knob. Just like virtually every Pong console, there's no AI to any of the games here. You have to play these against a human opponent. There were multiple revisions of the hardware, and you can usually tell these apart by color of plastic. Mine are the earliest hardware revisions, not because I was specifically hunting for them, just how it turned out. And they're bright yellow. Later revisions of the 6 were white, and later revisions of the 15 were more orange. The big thing about this first revision is that it doesn't have analog controls. The paddle always moves at full speed, which happens to be much slower than you probably want it to be. The dials are actually spring-loaded. You'll twist one, and then when you let go it pops back to center. And the controller just has a micro switch inside it that you trip when you twist the knob. So if you want one of these to play, you probably want a later revision of the hardware, but if you want one to collect, then you need to feel for the springy knobs. 7 of the 8 game modes are identical. You move the paddle up and down the screen, and deflect the ball back and forth. If your opponent misses and it goes off their side, then you get a point, and you're playing until someone has 15 points. There are 4 option switches on the console that modify the games. Both sides have an option for large or small paddle, basically a way to make it harder for a player. The speed switch actually has 3 positions, and it solely controls how quickly the ball moves. And finally, you have the choice of singles or doubles. For singles, each side has 1 paddle. For doubles, a second one is added in front of it. There's several quirks to the system that you might notice as I'm playing. First, your paddle is not constrained to the screen. You can go off the top and reappear at the bottom, and vice versa. Second, you can change game modes in the middle of play. This platform is built on transistor logic rather than a microcontroller, and so the effects of the switches aren't handled by any kind of computer logic. It's literally the bare electronic circuits. Which means flipping the switch changes that circuit while you're playing. This even extends to the game modes themselves. You could be playing in a game mode and then just flip down to another one and the ball doesn't even stop moving. The green button on the console acts as a reset switch, putting the game back to the original state, which essentially means 0-0 score, paddles in the middle, and the ball automatically launching into the first volley. The primary difference between the game modes is the playfield. Some of them have obstacles in the middle, some of them add bars to deflect the ball at the edge of the screen, so that you have a narrow area where you can score points. Let's go through the game modes very quickly. Tennis A has dots in the middle that deflect shots. Tennis B has a dashed line down the middle that doesn't deflect anything. It's the most like traditional Pong. Hockey A adds the narrow goal and the dashed line in the middle can deflect shots, plus the middle bars will appear and disappear. Hockey B is the same as Hockey A, only it's a completely open play field. Volley A brings back the dots in the middle, and they seem to be a little bit better at blocking your shots here, although that might just be me. Volley B has the bars in the middle, and this time they can deflect your shots. And finally, Ping Pong has a tiny little net at the bottom of the screen that can possibly deflect you. The final game mode you're unlikely to figure out without the manual. It's a shooting game. You press the red button on the console to fire a bullet out of your paddle on the left-hand side of the screen, and you want to hit the person on the right-hand side of the screen. Every time you fire a bullet, your score goes up by 1, and every time you hit an opponent, the score on the right-hand side goes up by 1. So you're supposed to be keeping track of how many bullets you have left, because the game will end when you reach 15, and you want to hit them as many times as possible, which will be their score at the end. If you're playing this with doubles mode on, then it's possible to hit the target twice with one shot, which means that you can reach 15 hits and end the game before you run out of bullets. And that's all there is to these systems. I mean, they're games from 1977. They're not going to have a whole lot to them. And honestly, the only really interesting thing about them is that Nintendo name. As Pong consoles, they're substandard. The controls are bad, and the game modes aren't really well thought through. I did like having all of those options on the front of the console, though they revealed just how primitive this machine is. These are wonderful collector's items. The very first Nintendo video games. They're just not the versions of Pong that you'd want to play.